On the evening of the 7th of December, 1941, the war reached American homes, not through explosions or gunfire, but through instruction. The lights were dimmed, windows were covered, street lamps were switched off or shielded. Along the eastern seaboard of the United States, darkness became policy almost overnight, not because the enemy had arrived, but because he might. Pearl Harbor reframed distance. Until that moment, the Atlantic had seemed wide enough to protect the mainland from direct danger. After that attack, the ocean became a corridor instead of a barrier. The question facing American authorities was not whether the United States was at war, but where that war might touch civilian life. The answer came quickly and quietly. It would touch the night. Within days, federal guidance began to circulate. The Office of Civilian Defense was tasked with translating military concern into civilian behavior. Its mandate was broad but imprecise: to prepare the population, reduce vulnerability, and sustain morale without provoking panic. Along the East Coast, that mandate converged on a single vulnerability shared by every city, town, and harbor: light. At sea, light was information. It outlined ships against the horizon. It marked ports, channels, and coastlines with unintentional clarity. Naval intelligence reports, shaped in part by British experience earlier in the war, warned that illuminated shorelines could turn merchant traffic into silhouettes. Submarines did not need advanced detection systems when cities provided backlighting. Darkness, by contrast, promised concealment. It could not stop submarines from operating, but it might deny them easy targets. By late December 1941 and into January 1942, blackout regulations began to appear along the coast. They were neither uniform nor synchronized. Each city adapted federal guidance to its own geography and infrastructure. New York City issued strict light control orders for waterfront areas. Smaller coastal towns focused on residential windows and street lighting. Inland cities experimented with partial drills, anticipating air raids that never materialized. What linked these measures was not a shared assessment of danger, but a shared uncertainty about how close that danger might be. Responsibility fragmented quickly. The federal government set the tone, but enforcement fell to states and municipalities. Mayors, police departments, and newly appointed civil defense coordinators interpreted guidance in real time. In New York City, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia became one of the most visible public voices, explaining blackout rules over the radio while promising both firmness and reassurance. The message was consistent. This was not panic. This was preparation. For civilians, the adjustment was immediate and intimate. Blackout policy reached into kitchens and bedrooms. Curtains were pinned tighter. Lights were repositioned away from windows. Porch bulbs were unscrewed. In coastal neighborhoods, residents were instructed to shield even brief flashes, opening a refrigerator door, striking a match, turning on a hallway light. The ordinary rituals of the evening were relearned under constraint. There was no single night when darkness fell everywhere at once. Instead, it arrived in increments. Trial drills were announced in advance, then repeated without warning. Sirens sounded in some cities and remained silent in others. Confusion was common, but so was compliance. People did not yet know how real the danger was, but they understood the cost of ignoring instructions if that danger proved real. Behind the scenes, military concern grew faster than public fear. The United States Army Eastern Defense Command coordinated coastal defenses, stretching from Maine to Florida, responsible not only for troops and fortifications, but for assessing civilian vulnerability. Reports from naval officers emphasized how brightly lit harbors could compromise shipping. In some cases, the recommendations were blunt. Either the lights went out, or the losses continued. What complicated the picture was timing. In early 1942, the United States had not yet fully organized coastal convoys or air patrols. Merchant ships still moved independently along familiar routes. Cities, by contrast, could change behavior overnight. From the perspective of defense planners, blackouts were one of the few tools that could be implemented immediately, without waiting for ships, aircraft, or crews. Yet blackouts were also an experiment. No one could say with certainty how effective they would be, or how long civilians would tolerate them. Officials understood that darkness carried its own risks: traffic accidents, industrial disruption, public anxiety. But those risks were weighed against an enemy whose presence was invisible and whose intentions were unknown. In this calculation, darkness appeared manageable. Illumination did not. The language used to justify blackouts reflected this balancing act. Public notices emphasized cooperation rather than coercion. Newspaper articles described drills as temporary precautions, not permanent sacrifices. Radio broadcasts framed darkness as a contribution, something civilians could do while soldiers and sailors fought elsewhere. The goal was not merely to hide cities, but to align civilian behavior with wartime necessity. As weeks passed, darkness became less dramatic and more procedural. It was folded into routine, regulated by schedules and reminders. People learned when to expect drills, how to prepare their homes, and how to move through streets, lit only by shielded lamps and moonlight. The blackout ceased to feel like an emergency measure and began to resemble infrastructure, an imposed condition of life during war. But one question remained unanswered, and it hung over every darkened street and harbour. Was this enough? The enemy had not been seen, but he had not been ruled out either. If ships continued to burn offshore, then darkness might prove insufficient or too unevenly applied to matter. As blackout drills became stricter and more frequent, the coastline waited for confirmation that the sacrifice was justified, even as fires on the horizon began to supply their own unsettling answer. In the first weeks of 1942, reports arrived from the Atlantic coast that felt unreal in their proximity. Merchant ships were burning within sight of shore. Lifeboats drifted toward beaches. In some places, residents watched explosions from boardwalks and dunes, the glow of oil fires reflecting off low clouds. The war that blackout drills were meant to anticipate was no longer hypothetical. It was offshore and close. The cause was a German naval offensive known to Allied planners as Operation Paukenschlag, the Drumbeat. German submarines moved westward across the Atlantic and found an American coastline unprepared for their methods. There were a few coastal convoys, limited air patrols, and ports that remained brightly lit. For submarine commanders, the conditions were unexpectedly favorable. Targets outlined themselves against illuminated cities, and shipping lanes were easy to read. Along the coasts of New Jersey, North Carolina, and Florida, sinkings mounted through the winter and spring. Tankers, freighters, and smaller cargo vessels were struck with alarming regularity. Newspapers reported losses cautiously, but the pattern was visible. When ships burned at night, they were visible from miles away, and those fires reinforced the belief that light was a liability. Naval officers pressed the point with increasing urgency. Shore lighting, they argued, was not a background detail, it was an operational factor. Harbours, refineries, and coastal towns produced a constant glow that outlined vessels moving along predictable routes. In this environment, submarines did not need to hunt aggressively. They waited. This assessment placed civilian authorities in a difficult position. Blackout drills had been introduced as precautionary measures, framed as preparation against a possible future threat. Now, the threat was demonstrably present, but the tools available to address it remained limited. Warships and aircraft took time to deploy. Convoy systems required coordination and escort vessels that were not yet available in sufficient numbers. Darkness, once a rehearsal, became a frontline measure by default. As a result, blackout policies tightened. In many coastal cities, drills became mandatory rather than voluntary. Waterfront districts faced stricter enforcement. Lights visible from the sea were targeted: first piers, factories, hotels, and amusement areas along beaches. In some communities, Entire stretches of coastline were ordered into near-total darkness after sunset. The logic was straightforward, but its implementation was uneven. Some cities complied quickly, issuing detailed instructions and enforcing them rigorously. Others struggled to balance economic activity with defense. Ports needed to operate. Refineries and shipyards required light to function safely. Coastal tourism, though diminished by war, had not vanished overnight. Each exception weakened the overall effect, and naval observers noted the inconsistencies. At the federal level, pressure mounted on civilian agencies to close these gaps. The Office of Civilian Defense circulated revised guidance, emphasizing coastal vulnerability and the importance of uniform compliance. The tone shifted subtly. What had been framed as civic cooperation was increasingly described as a necessity. Blackouts were no longer about readiness. They were about mitigation. Public perception shifted as well. For many civilians, the sight of burning ships resolved any lingering doubts about the seriousness of the drills. Darkness became easier to accept when its absence appeared to have consequences. In coastal towns, compliance with blackout rules rose not because enforcement improved, but because the rationale became more visible. The horizon provided its own argument. Still, the effectiveness of darkness remained difficult to measure. Ships continued to be sunk, even as some areas darkened more thoroughly. This fueled debate within both military and civilian circles. Were blackouts working at all, or were they merely symbolic gestures, layered onto a problem that required naval solutions? Some reports suggested that submarines adjusted tactics, operating farther offshore or attacking during daylight. Others noted that illuminated areas continued to attract losses. What complicated assessment was timing. The period of heaviest sinkings coincided with the gradual tightening of blackout measures, making it difficult to separate cause and effect. Darkness may have reduced certain risks while leaving others unchanged. It may have denied easy silhouettes without preventing attack altogether. For planners, this ambiguity was frustrating but unavoidable. As spring turned to summer in 1942, the pressure to act decisively grew. The Navy accelerated the implementation of convoys and expanded air patrols along the coast. These measures promised clearer results, but they would not take full effect immediately. In the meantime, blackouts remained one of the few visible responses available to civilian authorities, a way to demonstrate action while larger systems came online. In some cities, officials quietly acknowledged the limits of what darkness could do. Internal correspondence reflected an understanding that blackouts could not substitute for escorts or radar, but could only complement them. Publicly, however, the message remained consistent. Darkness was framed as part of a layered defense, not a standalone solution. For civilians, the experience was mixed. Blackouts no longer felt abstract, but they did not bring reassurance either. Each night of darkness was accompanied by news of fresh sinkings, reinforcing a sense that the enemy remained ahead of the response. The coastline was darker than before, yet the fires offshore continued. This tension between visible effort and uncertain outcome defined the middle months of 1942. Blackout drills had become stricter, more disciplined, and more widely accepted. But as long as ships kept burning within sight of land, a question lingered over every darkened harbour and shuttered window. If the coast was finally going dark, why did the war still seem so close? The answer, still forming beyond the horizon, would force authorities to look beyond darkness alone and to reconsider how much responsibility civilian measures could bear when the enemy had already arrived. By mid-1942, blackout rules existed on paper across much of the United States East Coast, but paper alone could not dim a window or switch off a porch light. For the policy to function, it had to move from regulation to behavior, and that transition depended not on soldiers or police, but on civilians watching civilians. To bridge that gap, cities activated a new layer of authority: Air Raid Wardens. Drawn from local communities, they were volunteers, shopkeepers, clerks, retirees who received armbands, flashlights, and instruction manuals. Their role was simple in description and complicated in practice. Patrol neighborhoods during blackout hours, identify violations, and ensure compliance without provoking panic or hostility. The system expanded rapidly. Under guidance coordinated through the Office of Civilian Defense, cities divided themselves into small sectors, each assigned a warden responsible for dozens of households. The design was deliberate. Familiarity was meant to soften enforcement. A neighbor's knock on the door carried a different weight than an officer's citation. In theory, wardens advised first and reported only when necessary. In practice, the line between guidance and enforcement was blurred. Some residents complied immediately, apologizing as they adjusted a shade or extinguished a light. Others resented the intrusion, questioning both the authority of the warden and the necessity of the rule. The blackout turned private space into a regulated zone, and not everyone accepted that transformation quietly. Municipal governments attempted to standardize the process. Notices explained acceptable lighting levels. Newspapers published diagrams showing how to shield bulbs and windows. Radio broadcasts reminded listeners that even a brief flash could be visible from the sea. The emphasis was educational, but it was reinforced by the possibility of penalties. Fines were authorized in many jurisdictions, though they were applied unevenly and often reluctantly. The unevenness was not accidental. City officials understood that heavy-handed enforcement risked backlash. Blackouts required cooperation more than coercion, and morale was treated as a resource that could be depleted. As a result, most violations were handled informally through warnings, reminders, and repeat visits. The presence of wardens was meant to normalize compliance rather than terrorize households. Despite this restraint, tensions emerged. In dense urban neighborhoods, the frequency of inspections bred irritation. In working-class districts, residents complained that blackout rules ignored the realities of shift work and overcrowded housing. In wealthier areas, exemptions and modifications fueled suspicion that enforcement was selective. Darkness, intended as a shared burden, exposed existing social fractures. Accidents added another layer of strain. Reduced street lighting led to collisions and injuries, particularly among pedestrians unfamiliar with navigating near darkness. Emergency services adapted, but each incident became part of the argument against strict enforcement. Critics asked whether the risks created by blackouts outweighed the risks they were meant to reduce. Officials responded by adjusting rules rather than abandoning them. Shielded streetlights replaced fully extinguished ones in some areas. Headlight covers were redesigned to improve visibility without projecting beams outward. Factories received exemptions contingent on shielding and orientation. These adjustments further complicated enforcement, requiring wardens to interpret both exceptions and rules. What sustained the system was not clarity, but momentum. By late 1942, blackout enforcement had become routine. Wardens developed patterns, residents learned expectations, and violations declined through familiarity rather than fear. Darkness became less a moment of crisis and more a managed condition, an inconvenience folded into wartime life. Yet the emotional cost remained. Constant vigilance carried fatigue. Each knock on the door, each reminder to dim a light, reinforced the sense that danger was close, even when unseen. For some, this awareness fostered solidarity. For others, it produced quiet resentment. Both reactions coexisted within the same streets, sometimes within the same households. From the planner's perspective, enforcement was a partial success. Compliance improved, visibility from shore decreased, and the coastline grew darker than it had been at any point in peacetime. But enforcement also revealed the limits of civilian discipline. Darkness could be ordered, monitored, and corrected, but it could not be made effortless. As blackout patrols continued night after night, a question began to surface within city halls and defense offices alike. Even if the night could be enforced, could it be sustained? And if vigilance began to erode under its own weight, what would happen to a system that depended on ordinary people maintaining extraordinary discipline? The answer would not come from a single violation or a single protest, but from the gradual accumulation of strain forcing authorities to confront how much darkness a civilian society could be asked to carry, and for how long. By 1942, the logic of blackouts had moved beyond homes and streets and into the machinery of production. Along the East Coast, shipyards, refineries, rail terminals, and power plants operated around the clock, feeding a war effort that tolerated little interruption. These facilities were often located near water, precisely where blackout rules were most stringent. The collision between industrial necessity and coastal darkness became unavoidable. From the outset, authorities understood that a total blackout was impractical. Production could not simply stop after sunset. The challenge was not whether industry would be exempted, but how. The solution emerged in layers: shielding, angling, and containment. Lights could remain on, but they had to be hooded. Windows had to be painted or curtained. Illumination had to fall inward, not outward. And anything visible from the sea was treated as a vulnerability. These adaptations were costly and uneven. Large firms with capital and engineering staff installed baffles and redesigned lighting systems. Smaller workshops improvised, sometimes crudely, sometimes not at all. Compliance varied not only by city but by industry, creating a patchwork of darkness and glow along the coastline. From offshore, the effect was unclear. From within cities, the distinctions were obvious. Safety became the central argument against stricter enforcement. Reduced lighting increased the risk of accidents on factory floors, along rail lines, and on roads used by night shift workers. Reports of collisions and injuries accumulated through 1942, particularly in urban areas where street lighting had been sharply reduced. Emergency services adapted with shielded vehicles and adjusted response protocols, but the margin for error narrowed. Municipal leaders found themselves balancing two forms of risk that could not be easily compared. On one side was the possibility that visible light aided enemy action. On the other, there was the certainty that darkness changed how people moved and worked. Neither risk could be eliminated, only managed. Policy became an exercise in compromise rather than resolution. Resistance took quiet forms. It rarely announced itself as opposition to the war. Instead, it appeared that exceptions stretched wider than intended. Rules were interpreted loosely, and inspections were delayed. A factory argued that a particular window could not be covered without halting production. A port authority claimed that navigation lights were essential for safety. A city allowed more streetlights to remain shielded rather than extinguished outright. Each decision was defensible on its own. Collectively, they diluted the blackout. Legal challenges were rare but telling. When they occurred, they tended to focus on liability rather than principle. Who was responsible if an accident occurred under blackout conditions? Was a city liable for injuries caused by reduced lighting? These questions did not dismantle the policy, but they forced refinements. Blackouts were adjusted not because they were abandoned, but because their consequences were now visible on land as well as at sea. Public opinion reflected this tension. Support for blackouts remained broad, but enthusiasm faded. As the novelty wore off, inconvenience took its place. People complied, but they also complained about dark commutes, about inconsistent rules, about the sense that sacrifice was unevenly distributed. Industrial exemptions, necessary as they were, sharpened this perception. Darkness felt shared only up to a point. Officials responded with reassurance rather than escalation. Blackouts were framed as temporary, adaptive, and responsive to changing conditions. Newspapers published explanations of shielding techniques and safety adjustments. Radio broadcasts acknowledged difficulties while reiterating the purpose. The message was no longer about urgency alone. It was about endurance. By late 1942 and into 1943, the policy settled into a negotiated state. Blackouts remained in force, but they were more selective. Waterfronts stayed dark, while interior districts regained limited lighting. Industrial facilities operated under detailed guidelines enforced more through inspection than through punishment. The system survived not by rigidity, but by flexibility. This adaptability had a cost. Each exception raised the question of whether the blackout was still serving its original purpose. Naval observers continued to note inconsistencies, even as convoy systems and air patrols began to reduce sinkings. The blackout was no longer the only line of defense, but it had not been rendered obsolete either. It existed in an uneasy middle ground, neither decisive nor irrelevant. What became clear was that darkness alone could not carry the burden placed upon it. It could reduce exposure, but it could not reconcile all competing demands. Industry had to function. Cities had to remain navigable. Civilians had to tolerate inconvenience without losing trust in the system. Blackout policy stretched to accommodate these realities, even as it risked losing coherence. As the war effort grew more effective at sea, the question shifted subtly. The issue was no longer whether blackouts could be enforced, but whether they still needed to be enforced at the same intensity. With submarines less visible and defenses more robust, the balance between protection and disruption was recalculated. The night remained darker than it had been before the war, but it was no longer absolute. Light began to return in controlled forms, shaped by necessity rather than fear. And in that gradual adjustment lay a signal that the blackout, once a frontline response, was becoming something else, no longer an emergency measure, but a managed condition, awaiting reassessment. By 1942, the blackout was no longer new. Its power no longer came from surprise, but from repetition. What began as an emergency response settled into a rhythm. Lights dimmed at dusk, windows covered, patrols moving through familiar routes. The night did not feel safer, but it felt known. For civil defense planners, that shift mattered as much as any reduction in visibility from the sea. Fear, left unmanaged, spread faster than submarines. The challenge facing authorities was not only to reduce vulnerability, but to prevent anxiety from becoming corrosive. Blackout drills were recast accordingly, not as reactions to imminent attack, but as disciplined habits. The goal was steadiness, not alarm. Public messaging reflected this recalibration. Newspapers printed instructions with less urgency and more explanation. Radio broadcasts emphasized calm compliance rather than danger. The language changed subtly. Darkness was described as prudent, cooperative, even civic. Blackouts became something people did together, not something imposed upon them. This framing did not eliminate fear, but it contained it. The absence of air raids on the East Coast created a paradox. The threat was real enough to justify ongoing precautions, yet distant enough to invite doubt. Without visible enemy action overhead, anxiety risked drifting into skepticism. Blackout drills, repeated and regulated, filled that gap by maintaining a sense of participation without demanding constant alarm. For many households, the blackout became a marker of wartime identity. Children learned the rules as part of daily life. Families organized evenings around dimmed rooms and limited movement. The inconvenience was acknowledged but also normalized. Darkness became a contribution, a quiet form of service that did not require enlistment or uniforms. Volunteer wardens played a crucial role in this psychological balance. Their presence reinforced seriousness without militarizing neighborhoods. Because they were familiar faces, their authority felt personal rather than imposed. They reminded residents not only of the rules, but of the shared purpose behind them. In this way, enforcement doubled as reassurance. At the same time, fatigue set in. Months of compliance dulled the sense of urgency. Missed lights were corrected more out of habit than conviction. Complaints about inconsistency grew sharper. Why were some streets brighter than others? Why did factories receive exemptions while homes did not? These questions did not signal rejection of the blackout, but they did test its legitimacy. Authorities responded by emphasizing adaptability. blackouts were portrayed as living systems, adjusted to reflect changing conditions at sea and on land. When restrictions were eased in certain areas, officials explained the rationale, rather than declaring victory. When drills continued, they were justified as insurance, rather than emergency response. The aim was to keep fear proportional, to neither amplify nor dismiss it. This balancing act was visible in how information about submarine activity was handled. Reports of sinkings were published, but without the details that might provoke panic. The connection between darkness and defense was maintained, but cautiously. Officials avoided claiming that blackouts alone prevented attacks, recognizing that overstatement would collapse credibility if contradicted by events. Psychologically, the blackout served as a stabilizer. It channeled anxiety into routine. Instead of wondering what might happen, civilians knew what was expected of them each night. This predictability did not eliminate worry, but it prevented it from escalating unchecked. In a war defined by distance and uncertainty, that containment was itself a form of defense. There were limits. Not everyone experienced darkness as reassurance. For some, it heightened isolation. Reduced lighting made cities feel smaller, quieter, and more fragile. Nighttime accidents and delays reinforced the sense that normal life had been suspended. The blackout reassured collectively, but it burdened individuals. Planners were aware of this tension. Internal assessments acknowledged that prolonged restrictions risked eroding morale, if not paired with visible progress elsewhere. As naval defenses improved and convoy systems expanded, officials quietly counted on success at sea to justify endurance on land. The blackout was sustained not because it stood alone, but because it aligned with a broader trajectory toward control. By late 1943, the psychological landscape had shifted. The sense of imminent danger receded, even as blackouts persisted. Darkness no longer signaled crisis. It signaled continuity. The war was ongoing, but it was no longer expanding into civilian space. Instead, civilian space had adapted around it. This adaptation was the blackout's most durable effect. It taught a population how to live under constraint, without constant fear. It transformed anxiety into habit, and vigilance into routine. Whether or not darkness directly altered the outcome at sea, it reshaped how civilians related to the war, less as spectators, more as participants in its management. As the night grew familiar, another question began to surface. If fear had been contained and defenses improved, what purpose did darkness now serve? Was it still a necessary shield? Or had it become a symbol, maintained by momentum alone? The answer would emerge not in a single decision, but through gradual relaxation, through lights returning in stages, and through the quiet acknowledgement that the blackout's role was changing, even as its legacy endured. By late 1943, the nights along the US East Coast were still darker than they once were, but no longer absolute. There was no announcement marking the change. No sirens signaled an end. Instead, light returned in fragments, an extra shielded lamp here, a relaxed rule there introduced quietly, justified carefully, and rarely framed as a reversal. The shift began offshore. Convoy systems were now routine, air patrols more consistent, and coastal defenses better coordinated. Sinkings declined, not suddenly, but steadily. Reports that once arrived weekly now came less often. The horizon no longer glowed with the same frequency. For planners, this change altered the calculus. Darkness had been adopted to compensate for the absence of escorts, of patrols, of preparedness. As those gaps closed, the burden placed on civilians could be adjusted. Civil defense agencies responded incrementally. Waterfront restrictions remained tight the longest, but interior districts saw a gradual easing. Fully extinguished streetlights were replaced with shielded fixtures. Certain commercial areas were permitted limited illumination under revised guidelines. The language used to explain these changes was cautious. Officials avoided declaring the danger past. Instead, They emphasized improvement conditions had changed, therefore, measures could change with them. Public reaction was muted. After years of blackout routines, small increases in light felt less like victory and more like relief. People noticed first what returned to normal, safer streets, easier commutes, fewer nighttime accidents. The blackout's disappearance was almost as quiet as its arrival, absorbed into daily life rather than celebrated. Fatigue played a role in this acceptance. By 1943, many civilians had carried the discipline of darkness for more than a year. Complaints about inconsistency and inconvenience had accumulated. Local governments, sensitive to morale, weighed these pressures against declining naval threat assessments. Relaxation became not only defensible, but necessary to sustain public trust. The process was uneven. Some cities moved faster than others, guided by geography, infrastructure, and local leadership. Coastal towns with direct exposure remained cautious longer. Inland areas regained light sooner. This variability mirrored the way blackouts were introduced, locally interpreted, locally enforced, locally unwound. What did not change immediately was the language of readiness. Drills continued, though less frequently. Wardens remained in place, though their patrols were reduced. The system was not dismantled, it was idled. Darkness remained available as a tool, should conditions worsen again. This posture reflected uncertainty rather than confidence. The war was not over, and planners were reluctant to surrender measures that proved manageable. By mid-1944, however, the direction was clear. The blackout had shifted from necessity to contingency. Many coastal restrictions were eased, and enforcement became largely symbolic. The night regained depth and texture, shop windows glowed softly, street grids reappeared, harbours reflected controlled light rather than complete absence. In retrospect, the change felt inevitable. The blackout was never meant to stand alone. It was a bridge, built quickly, intended to carry civilians through a period when defences lagged behind the threat. As that gap closed, the bridge was no longer central. It did not collapse. It was simply bypassed. For those who lived under it, the memory of darkness remained sharp. People recalled how quickly behavior changed, how routines adapted, how the absence of light reshaped familiar spaces. The return of illumination did not erase that experience. It framed it. Darkness became something endured, not something permanent. Yet even as lights returned, the blackout left behind habits. People remained attentive to windows and shades. Coastal lighting was redesigned with shielding in mind. Emergency planning retained the assumption that civilian infrastructure could be regulated if necessary. The lesson absorbed was not fear, but capacity, the realization that large populations could adjust rapidly under coordinated guidance. The gradual relaxation of blackout rules signaled more than improved security. It marked a shift in how the war touched civilian life. The coastline was no longer a place of constant anticipation. The night no longer carried the same weight. What remained was a sense that the boundary between war and home, once blurred by darkness, was slowly being restored. And with that restoration came a final reckoning. If the blackout could be imposed, sustained, and eased without catastrophe, what did that reveal about the relationship between civilians and modern war? The answer lay not in how the lights went out, but in how they came back quietly, unevenly, and with lessons that would outlast the threat that first made darkness necessary. When blackout restrictions receded along the U.S. East Coast, they left behind more than restored lighting. They left a record of how civilian life was reorganized under pressure and what that reorganization revealed about power, trust, and endurance. The absence of bombs did not mean the absence of impact. For nearly 3 years, darkness functioned as a form of governance, quiet, procedural, and intimate. Measured narrowly, the blackout resisted simple judgment. It did not stop submarines by itself. Sinkings declined primarily because convoys, patrols, and intelligence improved at sea. Yet archival assessments suggested that light control reduced easy targeting during a vulnerable period. buying time when other defenses were incomplete. Darkness did not win the battle. It narrowed the margin of loss while the battle was being organized elsewhere. Measured more broadly, the blackout achieved something less quantifiable, but no less consequential. It demonstrated that modern war could extend into civilian infrastructure without destroying it. Streets, homes, factories, and ports were not militarized by force. They were regulated through instruction, persuasion, and routine. Compliance was imperfect, but sustained. That endurance mattered. The system worked because it aligned authority with familiarity. Federal guidance set parameters, but local institutions translated them into practice. Mayors explained, newspapers instructed, radio reassured, and volunteer wardens enforced with a human face. The blackout relied on proximity, neighbors correcting neighbors, not on spectacle. In doing so, it preserved legitimacy, even as it restricted behavior. This approach carried risks. Uneven enforcement exposed social divides. Industrial exemptions sharpened perceptions of unequal sacrifice. Darkness increased accidents and strained morale. Yet the policy absorbed these pressures without collapsing. It adapted, negotiated, and adjusted, revealing a capacity for flexibility that would become a hallmark of later civil defense planning. Importantly, the blackout also clarified what civilian measures could not do. They could not substitute for naval power. They could not resolve strategic shortcomings at sea. Officials learned to speak about darkness with restraint, avoiding claims it could not sustain. That honesty, born of necessity, helped prevent the policy from becoming discredited when ships continued to sink. After the war, this lesson lingered. Civil defense did not disappear with the blackout. It changed form. Emergency planning retained assumptions, first tested in 1942, that civilian behavior could be coordinated at scale, that infrastructure could be rapidly reconfigured, and that morale could be managed through routine rather than fear. Later programs would revisit these assumptions in different contexts, sometimes with less success. For those who lived through the blackouts, memory fractured along lines of experience. Some remembered inconvenience and frustration, others remembered purpose. Many remembered the quiet, how familiar streets felt altered when stripped of light, how the night pressed closer, how the horizon seemed nearer than before. These memories rarely entered grand narratives of the war, but they shaped how civilians understood their role within it. The blackout also reframed the meaning of participation. Not everyone could enlist or work in war industries. Darkness offered a different kind of contribution, small, repetitive, and collective. It asked for patience rather than heroism. In doing so, it broadened the definition of what it meant to be involved in a total war. In retrospect, the most striking feature of the blackout was how quickly it faded from public attention. It ended without ceremony and left no monuments. Its success, such as it was, lay in its ordinariness. The lights went out, stayed out, and then came back on. Life resumed without needing to commemorate the interruption. Yet the interruption mattered. It showed that civilian space could be temporarily reshaped without being permanently damaged. It revealed that fear could be managed through structure, and that uncertainty could be met with coordination rather than panic. These insights were not inevitable. They were learned, tested, and adjusted in real time. The East Coast Blackouts were not a story of dramatic confrontation. They were a story of constraint, of how societies responded when the threat was indirect, the enemy unseen, and the solution imperfect. Darkness became a way to act in the face of uncertainty, to do something while waiting for larger forces to catch up. In that sense, the blackout did exactly what it was meant to do. It held the line not only against submarines, but also against disorder and fear. It transformed the night into a shared discipline, then released it when that discipline was no longer required. What remained was not a verdict of success or failure, but a clearer view of how modern war reached beyond battlefields. Sometimes it arrived as noise and destruction. Sometimes it arrived as silence measured, regulated, and enforced one light at a time. Darkness once shaped everyday life far from the front lines, and its lessons still matter. Like, subscribe, and share to support calm, factual history that looks beyond the battlefield. Join us as we continue exploring how war reshaped ordinary lives, one quiet decision at a time.